Hello, everyone. Welcome to Critical Faculty. I'm very excited today. I'm going to have my very first conversation with somebody that I've really wanted to have a word with for quite some time and talk about things that happened in the past and whether they happened the way we think they've happened or there might be different versions of the different stories we've heard about a group of people called the Israelites. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kipp Davis. Hello, Kipp. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. How are you?
Not too bad. Not too bad.
That's
Thanks
good.
very much.
You
Um,
suddenly made me nervous when you said you wanted to have a word with me. I
oh,
was
well, a good word,
like, okay.
in the context of the good news.
Oh, good. Oh, excellent.
um, right. I mean, this is an interesting conversation we're going to have today because we are going to go thousands in years in history, and we're going to try to maybe psychoanalyze some bunch of people and trying to find out what did they really think and believe, which is sometimes can be an impossible task.
Oh, absolutely. So, yeah, we're all just kind of wandering around in the dark a little bit, but that's what makes it fun.
Yeah, but there, do you think? I mean, I'm going to introduce you in a second here, and I'll
Yeah.
display your channel to the viewers of Critical Faculty. But as a warm up question here, do you think there are tangible cues that we can infer the people's behavior and habits and rituals that we can actually touch in terms of history?
Are like generally, are we talking
Uh,
about the
when it
biblical
comes to the
text?
Israelites.
When it comes to the Israelites, I actually think I'm a pretty conservative guy in the sense that when I read the Bible and when I attempt to reconstruct the texts, I like the idea of there being historical kernels behind the stuff that we read, and I certainly do think there are important touchstones. There's key points within the text that you can latch on to and say, ah, yeah, there's something in here, there's something that I can hold on to that maybe takes me back into this world that is now just like completely lost to us. And it's we can get into this, but when I used to teach my course, I would start by saying, it's a world that's far weirder and far more bizarre and far more foreign to us than I think anybody can even imagine just at a cursory glance, what's in the text.
Okay, folks, this is Dr. Davis's YouTube channel. I've been told, and you can see quite clearly, I think, five away from 8,000. So you are very encouraged to go have a look at the quality contents and subscribe.
Five guys, I need five.
Just to get to the
So,
8,000. But
just a yeah, yeah.
hopefully we'll get
I
some more towards the 9,000 today.
Oh yeah, now you're talking.
I've had a look at your YouTube channel. I mean, you seem to spend a lot more time on other people's channels. You're that kind of generous person. Um, but I can tell you now that anything that you will work with me on, it's also yours. So please feel free to upload to your channel.
No, cool. No, that's cool. Thank you.
Very good, very good. Also, I was very interested in your academic link that you've added to your site. So I'm going to display it in a second
Oh, is
because
that
it's
my
got,
academia page?
yeah, it's got
Yeah.
all your
Okay.
publications. I'm very
Yeah.
interested. Here it
Got
is.
a few of them. Yeah.
Yeah, lots of published papers in there. Really good. So here we go, guys. It's the link of that as well is in the description of the video. If you are interested in having a look at Dr. Davis's work in that regard. Right, let's dive into the conversation then.
Let's do
Uh,
it.
give, give us a little bit of a background. on that group of people. Where were they used to live, and what sort of numbers we're looking at?
Uh, well, so this is, I mean, right away we encounter problems right at the outset. When attempting to speak of ancient Israel, when attempting to speak of the religion of ancient Israel. In fact, the name of the course that I used to teach, I used to teach this course in an evangelical Christian university for a number of years, called Israelite religion. Um, I have some of the video lectures of that course on YouTube, but I have just gone through and completed basically revising the whole thing. I've then re-recorded everything in brilliant 4K. I've added some new lecture slides. So it's I mean it's the same course, but there's a lot of new stuff in it. Um, but the title that I've given to the course now is actually Ancient Israelite Religions,
Hmm.
plural, and that's deliberate because one of the issues that we encounter, with regards to this intersection between the textual sources that we have, which are all pretty much, yeah, the Hebrew sources are pretty much all in the Hebrew Bible. There's just a smattering of epigraphal sources that we can also draw from, which are, intensely interesting. But the textual sources themselves within the Hebrew Bible paint a picture of Israelite religion that is working as hard as it can to present something that is quite monolithic. So it requires scholars a lot of very careful attention to details in order to, I guess, mine the text, to deconstruct the text in order to discover uh, the I would say the more accurate picture of what's taking place, which is religious development, um, and religious competition within this critical period of history in this small region, this Sarah Palestine
Hmm.
area, in generally the Iron Age, from about 1000 BCE up to the Roman period, or the Hellenistic period at least. Um, so you're talking about a lot of time, um, and what's taking place within the text is this development of these ancient religious traditions that grows and changes and adapts to ongoing challenges and threats and situations. So right at the outset, you have to start from this perspective that the Hebrew Bible itself, our source material, is already, it's a product of this much later period in time, which makes it problematic because it's this product of this later period in time, and it's reflecting back using ancient sources, much earlier material in some cases, but then heavily redacting these sources. It requires a great deal of care and attention in order to um, peel back the layers, I
Yeah.
guess. So yeah, like the full title of the course is Ancient Israelite Religions: Facts on the Ground and Propaganda in the Bible. And it's illustrative of exactly what's going on here. I mean, we have one of the problems, I should say, the study of ancient Israelite religion, probably over the course of the last century, has changed rather dramatically. And the reason for this has to do a lot with the expansion of our knowledge of the area through archaeology. Um, as archaeology, grew out of its infancy at at the end of the 19th, at the beginning of the 20th century, and started to develop into a more critical science of sorts. uh we came to discover that the the picture of the people, the culture, and the religions of ancient Israel was really quite different from what you saw in the text. So really, what's taken place over the course of the last century is just, I think, these attempts over time to um, correctly understand what's in the archaeological record, but then how that relates to what has taken place in the text, and an effort to see where exactly do these traditions that we can see in the text line up with what we see in the archaeological record, and where doesn't it line up, and why. And usually, I mean, by and large, I tend to find that usually becomes the most fruitful, profitable question, is when we do see these stark differences, and and you start to ask the question why. That's when really you come to grips, you come face to face with 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 the reality of what these texts are,
Right.
which were by and large the product of these elite groups, these small elite groups of priests and kings living in Jerusalem. Although some of the material comes also from the northern kingdom in Samaria, or Shechem, as it was known in the earlier period. But the stories that they're telling is one, most often about royal power and temple ideology, and the uh, the preservation of the dynasty, and these sorts of larger themes, which become this grand narrative
Yeah.
of the biblical text. So
So, okay, well, it's to me, I'm watching religion sort of evolving over the last couple of decades, and how it's having to adapt to 21st century norms, and this is happening at the time of documentation and close scrutiny. Imagine how it when it at the very beginning, the how fast things were changing, because a lot of people think of Judaism, which is going to end up being linked to the
yeah,
Israelites, as the religion that first introduced monotheism to the world. But then we probably going to be discussing whether it actually was the case to start with.
with monotheism. Yeah, and that's so. I would even say that that is such a late development that it's barely something that uh, I even spent a lot of time touching on in my course, because I think what you're um getting at is, so first off, there is a very important distinction to be made here, and people quite often miss doing this, um between Judaism and whatever it was that preceded it. We call it ancient Israelite religion. I call it ancient Israelite religion, or ancient Israelite religions. This was a Syro-Palestinian, or a Syro-Phoenician, or a Canaanite religion. Really not altogether that distinct or unusual or different from precisely the same types of religious practices that we see on offer from their neighbors, and from, interestingly, those same groups of people who surrounded them, of whom the writers of the Hebrew Bible were intensely critical,
Hmm.
um, which is really intriguing. So what happens is, after the destruction of Jerusalem, in 586 BCE by the Babylonians, and the exile of the the basically the royal household, the entire priesthood, the leading citizens of Jerusalem, to Babylon. It's really in this new space, confronted by these new challenges, in the absence of a temple, in the absence of sacrifices, that this idea of Judaism starts to develop. And this is a development that takes place, over the course of the Persian and the Hellenistic period. And the monotheistic influence, I would suggest, is really coming predominantly from there. And in response to this um, this worldview altering crisis that the residents of Jerusalem have just endured. One of the things that I focus on a fair bit, in this discussion of ancient Israelite religion, is how closely, in particular for Jerusalem, how closely the temple is tied to the kingdom. We have this idea of the temple of Yahweh, so-called Solomon's temple, whether there ever was a Solomon or he built anything. The temple in Jerusalem that is identified as Solomon's temple, this first temple, this was not a public space. This was better understood as like a royal chapel. It was directly connected to the royal household, and this would have been, the Davidic dynasty. And again, whether or not there was an historical David, I like to think that there was, but that's me just being selfish about my particular reading of the narratives. But the royal family that controlled the city for at least a couple hundred years, I would think, between probably the 8th century to the destruction by the Babylonians in 586. At a minimum, you're looking at probably a 200-year period, and possibly even longer. But there is this promise that we see written pretty consistently throughout. We see it in the Deuteronomistic history, which are the books of Joshua, Judges, through to the end of Second Kings. We see it also echoed throughout a number of the 8th century prophets, certainly, and in huge numbers of the Psalms. This idea of this Davidic dynasty, the throne of David, the house of David, as the eternal rightful rulers and controllers of the city of Jerusalem. And this is directly connected to the temple. It's quite explicit, actually, throughout various important texts in the Hebrew Bible. And I think what people fail to grasp is when Nebuchadnezzar came back the second time, to finally destroy the city, destroy the temple. He took the sons of his installed ruler Zedekiah, who was part of the Davidic line. He executed all of his sons. Then he gouged out his eyes, and he shipped him off with everybody else to Babylon, and then destroyed the temple. This was the end. This was the end of the eternal kingdom, the eternal household of David, and along with it, the destruction of the house of Yahweh and if there were other deities also worshipped in the temple precincts at the time it was destroyed. I don't think we can be certain of that, but certainly this was such a cataclysmic event that it caused such a dramatic shift in thinking, in worldview for these people who for a couple hundred years now have aligned themselves with this guarantee of Yahweh's presence and his favor that's directly connected to their being a descendant of David sitting on the throne in Jerusalem.
So, if we're talking about the evolution of the ancient Israelite religions, and akin to the biological evolution, which is modification over time, and I
Yeah.
think we're going to be following a certain. And there's a common ancestor. Is El, the King of gods, the King of kings, is the common ancestor here, and whether Yahweh was still the link, because he was still maybe a demigod, a local god that had been glorified then and been chosen by the people to be their god, and therefore become distinguished in history. Because I think if you're a tribe without a god, you're nobody. You got to have a god.
Certainly, yes. And you're picking up a couple things here that are important. Yes, uh, what we know from certainly the surviving materials of surrounding cultures to Jerusalem and Samaria, and I've heard some pretty powerful arguments about the uh, the the cult of Yahweh first actually originating in Samaria in the north, and some of the best epigraphic remains that we have of Yahweh worship come from Samaria and the surrounding region. So that's interesting. And the suggestion is that the much wealthier, more powerful, more internationally connected Samaria, who had Yahweh as their chief tribal deity, this ends up getting imported into the much smaller, poorer, less significant kingdom of Judah, at some point, again in this pivotal period, sometime around the beginning of the 8th century. Yeah. So, but that's a bit of an aside. What we know of the region more generally is that there's a pantheon of deities that they seem to have in common, and we see a few of these mentioned within the biblical text as well. Most prominently is El, who is like the king of the gods or the father of all of these lesser gods. You've got Asherah, who is El's wife. He might be Baal's wife, or even Yahweh's consort or wife,
Mhm.
in accordance with some of the epigraphic materials. But you also have other deities too. I think there is an explicit mention of Mot, who is the god of death, in the book of Jeremiah, of course, because Mot in Hebrew is translated as death. These are the sorts
And
of
in Arabic as well, by the way.
yeah, right. So, but it's easy enough to just remove the personification of what I think is a pretty clear depiction of an actual deity. So, um, what something that we see taking place uh, in the course of this developmental picture, and I don't have precise, I don't think anybody has precise dates for this, but at some point um in the mid to late Iron Age, sorry, at some point in the early to mid Iron Age, Yahweh, at least for the the so-called Israelites, those who identify themselves as the sons of Israel, uh, at some point Yahweh begins to assert himself as the new king of the gods and is beginning to usurp the kingship of El. We see the same thing happening within the Ugaritic text with Baal. Baal actually ascends uh, to the throne of the gods um, in the Baal cycle. This is one of the featured events taking place within the Baal cycle, and he is basically deposing or replacing this great god, this king of the gods, El. We see El mentioned within the biblical text, and actually one of the most interesting passages. I mentioned this passage all the time in a number of uh, my videos. This passage from Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 to 9. The original text, which is preserved in the Greek translation of Deuteronomy in the Septuagint, but as well, we see it preserved in one of the manuscripts of the Dead Sea Scrolls, actually features the king of the gods identified by this title, Elyon. And it's been argued, I've seen it's been argued by some that this might actually be, you know, an Israelite version of El
Mhm.
called Elyon. I'm not sure I'm convinced by that. I think it's whether it's his name or his title, I think it's with reference to this same figure, this king of the gods, who divides his inheritance between his sons, the sons of the gods. And then this is verse 8 of Deuteronomy 32. And then verse 9 follows up and says, and Yahweh received his portion, Jacob, his allotment, Israel. So it's very interesting. We see this taking place in this idea of this plurality of deities in Deuteronomy, and I think we also see evidence of the ascension of Yahweh, of his his installation as the king of the gods in some readings of some of the Psalms. I might I think it's either Psalm 82. I think it might be Psalm 82. Uh, could be a psalm celebrating this this arrival, I guess, or this ascension of Yahweh to kingship.
Yeah, because at some point, and I'm getting the sort of the feeling that some Israelites might have actually associated Yahweh so closely with El that they ended up maybe thinking it's the manifestation of the same thing, like reference to El Shaddai, God Almighty, and whether El is the root name for God, like Al Ilah or Allah
Yeah.
or and if that means God, and then you need to have a name. I mean, just the title. God is the title, and there is a name that he cannot really utter, and that's why the Jews still cannot say his real name. Could it be that El is the title and Yahweh is his name?
I would I would say that is a later
Yeah,
develop.
yeah,
I mean, this is certainly what happens. But this is something that likely comes to us during the exilic, post-exilic period. The what scholars tend to see more prominently in the texts is a closer association between Yahweh and Baal. Um, and there is actually a handful of places within the text where there is some confusion as to whether um, the 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 address is to Baal or to Yahweh, because these two deities actually are the ones who tend to look so similar to one another. And I think it's yeah, it's sort of as I mentioned, it's a parallel thing taking place in the Hebrew Bible text that we see where much like in in Ugarit, Yahweh is starting to assert that same sort of um, power and superiority over the council of the gods. Whereas, in Ugarit, we see the same thing happening with Baal. Um, yeah, but you're definitely right. It's something that this equation between Yahweh and then Baal and then El is something that certainly takes place in the later editorial practices of those who really wrote the Hebrew Bible, certainly the Hebrew Bible as we have it,
So can
which
we, yeah, can we then safely say that that ancient world was henotheistic? El was always the chief god, and each tribe would like to have their own local little god, like a storm or desert god or god of irrigation, so something that is local, but then you always have that overarching god called El.
yeah, I would say something like that. Um, Henotheistic, uh, monolatry,
Mm,
polytheism. Sometimes I think that these, and I think the reason why that there's some obscurity here as to exactly what's going on sort of creates this confusion. I mean, really, there's a lot we really don't know. Um, I I would suggest that so, and because we're dealing with such a long period of time here too, right? Some of we may have echoes of some of these very early traditions, which appear in Exodus chapter 15 or in Judges chapter 5. What scholars tend to agree are the oldest texts of the Hebrew Bible. Um, but there's so much development that has taken place from when these texts were written to when the whole thing was pieced together and repackaged and turned into the Hebrew Bible, that it can be really difficult to see clearly precisely what the relationships are between the deities, and it's something that shifts over time as well. Something that you tend to get overwhelmed by if you just read the text on its face is the insistence on Yahweh's superiority. How much of this is an actual depiction of what was taking place within ancient Israel? Um, and was it taking place for everybody? Was it taking place for one group of Yahweh worshipers versus another group of Yahweh worshipers? Um, it just it's such a complex picture, and there's so much that we still don't know, that I tend to hesitate on I I guess saying for certain one way or the other what this relationship looks like.
yeah, I can see also a little bit of a competition because my understanding Baal
Yeah.
in Semitic language, again, that's reference to biology and evolution because one concept of evolution is survival of the fittest, and there's always competition and ecological pressure on species to survive. My understanding Baal in Semitic languages is also a title. It's a master or lord. And
Means
then
Lord
later on,
husband. Yeah.
yeah, and specifically a god of fertility and agriculture, and that's slightly opposite to Yahweh, who's more of a storm desert god. So are they contrasting type of gods? One for those who benefit from the luscious life of agriculture and abundance of food, and those who live in sort of in harsh conditions.
Yeah, it could be. And I think one of the reasons Yahweh as a deity gains prominence probably has something to do, you're right, with the geography
Mm.
of the area, and I just the difficulty of living um in the Judean highlands. It's not a it's not an
Yeah,
easy place. It was never an
yeah.
easy place to live, right? Um So yeah, insofar as how these two gods competed between one another, or how they were um venerated and worshipped relative to well, I mean that's really at the heart of it. Within ancient religions, you worship gods because of what they can do for
Mm,
you.
mm.
One of the things that that people I think tend to overlook or miss is that this is not I mean, it's not that people loved the gods. No, I mean, not in the same way that people love Jesus, or people
I was actually
love
going to
God today.
argue. I was going to argue that's maybe on the surface. I think very little has changed.
Yeah,
I think
perhaps.
people still want paradise and want to avoid hell.
No, no, no. No, that's true. But people also, sorry, excuse me. Excuse me. People also genuinely love Jesus,
Yeah,
right?
it's changed. Yeah,
They have this deep affection for him. That's just not how the ancients the ancients were afraid of the gods. I mean, it was very much a relationship. It was very much a situation where we have to do what these guys say, and we have to keep them happy, because if we don't, bad shit's gonna happen to us. So, um, I do a whole couple of lectures on the function of the temple, and I do a whole lecture on sacrifice and appeasement, the theory of sacrifice in the ancient
uh-huh.
Near East, the types of sacrifices, including uh, quite likely uh, child and human sacrifice. Um, these are the whole rationale for offering sacrifices to the gods. It starts from this idea that this is food. You
Mm.
have to feed them. You feed them to keep them happy. And when you send when you make offerings to Yahweh, um it gets really complicated, but perhaps the easiest way to understand it is sacrifices were, or animals in particular, were killed, and then um, depending on the type of offering you were making, they were either burned whole
Mhm.
completely, or you burned portions of them and then ate portions of them yourselves, or gave portions of them to the priests. um, this is how the priests made a living for themselves. uh the whole notion behind the system is that everything that's completely destroyed or burned, immolated, this is Yahweh's portion. This is what belongs to him. This is the part that we are giving to him. And there's this idea of transference between, like, the human realm and the divine realm that only occurs through death and destruction. So in order to get what you want to the god, you have to destroy it. You burn it. The language in the Hebrew Bible is actually really interesting, because um, the when sacrifices are offered up to Yahweh throughout, in particular, books of Exodus, Numbers, and Leviticus, there's an expression that repeats itself. Sacrifices are offered up as a pleasing odor to Yahweh. So the picture here is that he's sitting there, and he's like he's taking it in, right? You're burning your dead animal on the altar, and he's sitting there going,
Yeah, and
"Oh
you see,
yeah,
you like it. Yeah,
that's
yeah,
good. That's
that's the
good,
stuff.
right?"
That's the stuff.
So what I find quite interesting is that so the Hebrew word for uh nose is off. Um And it's also the most commonly occurring Hebrew word for wrath or anger. There's a clear etymological relationship here, but I don't think it's any accident that this is the picture that's portrayed, and what you're doing through the offering of a sacrifice to Yahweh is you are soothing him, you're appeasing him, you're settling that wrath, you're making it better for yourself, by basically giving Yahweh what he wants, which is, you know, dead animals. So, and this is and this is where the idea of uh the ban comes into play too. The cherem, which is the genocidal destruction
Yeah.
of the enemies of Yahweh and the enemies of Israel. This is precisely what this is. The text is explicit in saying that these are devoted things. In a few of the texts, it actually uses the word kadosh, which means holy or separate.
Hmm.
So these are separated to Yahweh, and what you do with anything that is devoted to Yahweh is you destroy it. So when Israel is sent out and given explicit instructions to destroy every man, woman, child, animal, and then to completely burn and destroy
You
a
know, Kip,
town,
I
city.
keep I keep getting these hints. I mean, keep talking about evolution, and I keep seeing elements of it. Because could it be because of the era before that magical era where people are so running around afraid of things, and that's magical era, and its avoidance of evil spirits was
Sure.
still prevalent, and it moved into a god who can take care of you, but you still have to appease them. Otherwise, they
Yeah.
can go really mad at you. And the evolution goes all the way to the love that we associate with Jesus. But I still think it's a Stockholm syndrome, because at
Yeah.
some point, those who hold you sort of captive, at some point you want to make sense of things. Otherwise, you go crazy about the hell and heaven. You're going to know it must be for a good reason. They must be loving me, but in their
Yeah.
own kind of special way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're totally onto something there. And I would say that is that's a development that makes good practical sense of how we see religious development in antiquity. So, but the point here being that this is, I mean, this is why Yahweh demanded these, these atrocious complete destructions of, a neighboring people, including, you know animals and buildings and children, because this was your offering to him. This was the devoted thing. So it's but
And it's
yeah,
still,
it's
I
it
mean, it's still continued in Judaism. The scapegoating
yeah.
is a practice, and Christianity is supposed to evolve from that. But then it came up with the biggest sacrifice of them all.
Yes, yes, the yes, the ultimate child sacrifice.
Yes.
um is and this is, I think, in terms of uh getting a clear sense of how sacrifice worked in ancient Israel and throughout these ancient Canaanite and other Near Eastern religions. uh you you had to make offerings. You couldn't just offer anything, right? There's certain, like, I mean, there's you could never, the book of Leviticus, the book of Exodus are quite explicit about what qualifies
Mm.
as an offering or a suitable sacrifice to Yahweh. And the prerequisite is that it's got to have some sort of function within the economy, which is why it's domesticated animals like sheep and cattle. You offer grain, you offer a wine that has been fermented and processed. You offer children who are part of a really critical part of your I guess your ability to sustain yourself and to sustain your family.
So
So
things of high value, basically.
yeah, so you can't offer, lizards that you find out in the desert, or snakes, or because these things don't have any value within this agrarian society, this economy. And I think this probably extends to as well within the Haram instructions. Uh, this is a replacement for basically, enslaving the captured peoples uh, to become uh, part of your workforce, or your labor. So a child sacrifice within this economy is really like the ultimate sacrifice. There's actually a really neat passage in Micah chapter 6. If I can just pull it up here, I'll read it to you. Um, or is it Micah? Depending on if it's the English or the Hebrew, it's Micah. It's either Micah 5 or Micah 6. Sorry. Um, so uh, yeah, it's Micah 6. So it says, Micah chapter 6, starting in verse 6. With what shall I come before Yahweh and bow myself? I'm reading from the NRSV here. And
Mhm.
bow myself before God on high. Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will Yahweh be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? And then he says, shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body, for the sin of my soul? So what you see here within
Leviticus.
this short description is a presentation of sacrifices that you would offer, that were typically offered to a deity. But you'll notice that they are listed in a
Yeah,
progression
yeah.
of value, right? The first on this list is uh
Birds, I
a
think.
year-old calf,
Yeah.
right? Then it's 1,000 rams, which is like I mean an incalculable type of sacrifice. And then next on that list is 10,000s of rivers of oil. Like, again, just an incalculable,
Yeah.
insane amount. And then at the top of that list is, my
Firstborn.
child, my
Yeah.
my firstborn son. So I think it it is the ultimate sacrifice. I tend to think, and here's the thing. I mean, we know scholars uh tend to be pretty confident that child sacrifice happened um in Canaanite as well as in Israel. We have attestations to that fact within the biblical records themselves. The archaeological remains of child sacrifice are almost impossible to, it's impossible to recover anything, in large part because infants are almost totally cartilage. The bones haven't developed properly, so when infants died, um they didn't leave any remains, um and in particular if you were burning them, to nothingness. So uh for that reason, it's difficult to pinpoint archaeologically, but we're pretty confident that this was practiced. uh, but the challenge here is in assessing, or even um, coming to a clear view of how widespread
And
this practice was, right?
and the Abraham, Isaac, Abraham, Ishmael, if you're a Muslim, then story will make sense because
Yeah.
Abraham is not surprised or shocked or anything. It looks like,
No.
oh, it's something that we used to do kind of thing. So, happy to do it
So
because it's not completely foreign.
see, no, and really, the shocking thing, the shocking thing in that story is not that God has, or Yahweh has asked Abraham to sacrifice his only son. The shocking thing is that Abraham has to do this um, at his advanced age, in the situation he is in, where he's almost certainly not going to have any more children.
Hmm.
One of the things, so the most current work done on this was by Heath Durrell, um, an excellent Hebrew Bible scholar that came out of Johns Hopkins University. He wrote his PhD dissertation on child sacrifice, and he discusses how more than likely, because child mortality rates were so high uh, in the period, in the time period, and in the region. I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 50% of um, firstborn children did not survive. They died within days, or were stillborn. Um, and an argument that used to be put forward, I know William Prop had suggested this, that there's no way it's you know evolutionary. I think he called it. Uh, did he call it evolutionary suicide? This idea that within this harsh culture that you would offer up everyone would offer up their firstborn son. You would basically eliminate any chance for the propagation of the species. But Durrell actually pretty, I think, convincingly demonstrated that within the ancient cultures, this actually works in large part because firstborn children were not likely to survive anyways. So when you had your firstborn son, and the women, the mothers bearing these children would have been in their early teens, right? Um, so this one was almost certainly like, okay, I've given birth to my first child. He's healthy. If I sacrifice my firstborn child, this will also then guarantee that I will have a lot more children. And
Yeah.
this is also what tended to reflect the ancient reality, where survival rates were a lot higher, just naturally, for your second, third, fourth
Then wouldn't the value?
child.
I'm thinking, of the also the sort of the Passover, and it's
Yeah,
again, it's always the firstborn, and it could it be
yeah,
there is a huge value on firstborn because your firstborn is the closest to you in age, and when you get to a certain age, that little child is going to be old enough to work, and then can really help you. Because they're close to you in age, and therefore they're more valuable than your latter child, who might still be an infant while you're, or a child while you're in old age.
that's an interesting point too. Honestly, I don't know.
Hmm.
But yeah, that could have some merit.
That's why I can see
Well,
always, the repetition of firstborn for, and as if it's the most valuable of all the children.
oh, it certainly is. And this is reflected too in the way the family operated in ancient Israelite society was such that um the father controlled a household which included all of it included his wives and his concubines, all his children, all the wives of his sons, or I should say, it included all of his sons, the wives of his sons, and his unmarried daughters and slaves. So, what would happen, at least according to the biblical text, when the father of a household passed on, um, his his inheritance was divided
Mhm.
between all of his surviving sons, um, and his oldest son would get a double portion of what everyone else got, and he would then assume the role as the new father of
Mhm.
the household. He's now in charge. this group. So it's, yeah, there's some of this, is playing into this idea, and it is, you're right, it's absolutely prevalent throughout the Hebrew Bible, the value that's set on the firstborn. But it's interesting because we see a counter narrative to this too, in particular, in some of the texts where a popular theme is the younger child basically surpassing. Um,
Joseph, for example.
I you could say Joseph. I was even going to just say Judah is not the
Yeah, yeah,
firstborn.
yeah, yeah.
The firstborn is Reuben, and yet Judah is the descendant of Jacob, who is always prominently featured. Most famously, Jacob is the younger brother of Esau, and Esau actually, um, sells him his birthright. And the other interesting thing about this is it's sealed with a vow, and the vow is taken so seriously that even though um their father has been duped. Elisha, sorry, Isaac has been duped into mistakenly giving his blessing to
Yeah.
Jacob instead of Esau. You'll notice within the text that he can't go back on it.
Yeah.
He
True.
actually he has to give Esau a different blessing. I mean, there's no do overs. When you make a vow, you've made the vow. You have to keep it.
Yeah.
Um, this is a critical element within the culture,
But
within
the
the
way I'm
society.
reading it is that we keep talking about competition at some point,
Yeah.
and it is very plausible that the history has repeated itself about the firstborn, the firstborn, the firstborn, and there comes a generation which say, "The hell with the firstborn, we're latter born, and we're gonna start writing a little bit of our own narrative, our own stories to represent us because we should be somebody." And then starting writing
Yeah.
narratives that adopt to the letterborn that can be as important and sometimes even more important. you know
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think yeah, I think that's probably true. So,
right.
yeah.
Now we progress with the story a little bit, so now maybe let's talk about Egypt. We did talk
Ah,
about Egypt just off air.
okay.
Were they? Is there any archaeological historical evidence that the ancient Israelites at some point were anywhere enslaved in Egypt?
Uh so I mean, this is a complicated question. I would say that as far as I know, um most scholars are convinced that there was no exodus. I mean, certainly nothing. Let me put it this way: there is nothing that looks anything like uh, the exodus that we read about in the Bible. However, I think that there is some potential traction to the idea of um, a, an, E- an Egyptian slave revolt of some sort, or a a um yeah, a an escape uh from, or an overthrow of Egyptian taskmasters that enters the the collective memory of these people at some point. And we actually see something that scholars will talk about quite a bit are competing traditions of Israel's origins. One of them is this Exodus story. Another one is this idea of descent from Jacob, and from the land of Aram, or Mesopotamia. And at some point, these stories end up getting fused. There's actually a really interesting prophecy. I encourage you, and I encourage the viewers, at some point, if you've got some time, take a look at Hosea chapter 12 and read the whole chapter. But then everywhere, as you're reading the story, where you see uh, the name Ephraim, then also maybe even highlight that with a colored highlighter, and then highlight Jacob with a different colored highlighter. Then go back and read through, and every time you see any sort of reference to traditions of the Exodus, to being in Egypt, to being delivered out of Egypt, to following a great prophet or a great leader out of Egypt, use that same colored highlighter that you used for Ephraim and mark those sections, and then go back again, and everywhere where you see stories alluded to from the patriarchal narratives, like the stairway to heaven, that Jacob um, uh, sees, or his the story of him competing or serving in order to marry the daughters of Laban, or wrestling with God. Use the same color that you used for highlighting the
Jacob.
Jacob. When you do that, and you take a look now at this prophecy as it's uttered in chapter 12, you can actually see a neat separation between two, I would say, independent national traditions, cultural memories. One belonging, I think one belonging to the southern kingdom, to Judah, who finds their heritage within Jacob, within you know. Uh, there's a famous text in Deuteronomy where the children the sons of Israel are supposed to proclaim, "I am the son of an Aramean. I came out of Mesopotamia." It's this kind of idea, these Jacob narratives. This is properly part of Judah's collective memory, their heritage. But then these Egyptian slave escape mosaic kind of traditions appear quite separate, actually, and they appear pretty closely tied to the Northern Kingdom. So that was a long, um, frustrating answer, no doubt. I would say that uh, there, there is nothing especially compelling from the archaeological record to say that there was anything that looked even remotely like an Exodus. But I think there's some traction to the idea that certainly part of Israelite culture came out of Egypt. And I think that there's potentially some traction to the idea that it came out in something that looked like a slave revolt or an escape, and that's about as much as we can know about it.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
right?
So if it happened, it would be highly exaggerated event.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah,
So,
because one of the key points of the relationship between Yahweh and the Israelites is a very important keyword, and it might betray everything about what the Bible, the Hebrew Bible is trying to tell us, and it's the idea of a covenant.
yeah, yeah,
So, and I'd
exactly.
like you to talk about that
So,
because that's very important.
yeah, for sure. So, now what the covenant language is within the text is uh, these th- these are pretty typical vassal treaties. This is something that a conquering ruler, a conquering king would come in and um, basically occupy and assert his authority over a weaker city or a town or a region, and he would subject them to this covenant or this treaty. It's kind of like mob rule, whereby I promise to protect you,
Yeah,
but in return, you have to give me all your shit.
Yeah, yeah.
Right?
It brings to mind those sort of mafia movies with Joe Pesci
Yeah.
and smashing a grocery shop and say, "I'm protecting you from myself."
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So and I mean the covenant language is it reflects a lot of the of the language and the structure that we see in particular these the I think most famously is the Neo-Assyrian treaty provides a very, very close structure and contains a lot of the same types of terminology and rhetoric as we see in the Book of Deuteronomy, for example, right? But this is what the covenant relationship is between the people and their God. He has promised to look out for them, to ensure their well-being, the and survival. um he's going to ensure that they have enough to eat, and that their borders will be secure, and that they will be kept safe from their natural enemies. And in return, he just expects, your total allegiance, uh, and the ongoing offering of sacrifices. So yeah, it's tied also. This is tied also then to the uh within the yeah, it's tied also to the station and the function of the king and the ruling house as well in Israel. We see in a number of psalms, in a number of the so-called royal psalms, are these descriptions of ensuring or keeping uh, the king happy, and by extension Yahweh, because the king is essentially Yahweh's representative to the people. um and it is through his success and his well-being that the whole nation, then the whole city, or the city and its vassals are um are kept safe and happy.
So,
So
so early on in the conversation, we're talking about earthly pleasures. We're talking about, okay, for your
yeah,
allegiance, for your worship, I'm going to
absolutely.
give you covenants. I'm going to give you land. Your offspring is going to rule, and still no conversation about an afterlife here. It's
No,
afterlife.
no,
There's no
not at all.
afterlife, and there's no Satan at that point.
No, certainly not. So at this period in time, you know, the 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 ancient Israelites had an understanding uh of um a a total natural death. Um when you died, you were dead. Your um well, in this case it would have been because they also didn't believe that we were um uh vessels of flesh animated by spirit. They had a much more monolatrous view of anthropology, whereby you were a whole person, and your physical being was your being. So you buried people, you buried the dead in the ground, with the idea that they would bodily then, you know, enter this place called Sheol, which was the realm of the dead, which was kind of a depressing, um, dark place where the what came to be known as the Raphaim would just go and stay. I can't really say they lived; they were dead, but they would go to this place. um, so there was no, I mean, there was no heaven, there was no hell, there was just Sheol, and everybody went to Sheol. It didn't matter who you were, it didn't matter what you did. Uh, this is where everyone went.
Even the
Um,
later word Gehenna is not what we think hell is like. It
no,
was
no,
more like a pit,
no.
isn't
This
it?
is yeah. So and actually, this is Gehenna is actually the word itself is a Greek transliteration of Gehinnom, which is the valley of the sons of Hinnom, which um at the time of certainly Ahaz, Manasseh, and Josiah, which would have been the 7th century. This was a place where there were uh, a form of human sacrifice called the Tophet, or the Molech, were offered specifically in this location, and the later uh the later inheritors of these traditions, like in the Babylonian, then the Persian Hellenistic period, when they're putting together the Hebrew Bible, the idea of human sacrifice became so onerous that they turned this valley basically into like a garbage dump.
Yeah. Did
So
you
as
say
by the
that?
time
Sorry, sorry to interrupt. Did you say the Hebrew word was Gehenom?
Yeah, it's Gay Hinnom, which is valley of it's actually Gay Bene Hinnom, which is the valley of the sons of Hinnom.
The funny thing
Um,
is, in the Quran in Arabic, the Islamic hell is Gehenna.
yeah,
So
right.
it's exactly the
It's
almost the same word.
very very much the same. So by the time we get to like the New Testament, so the it's this place of refuse with fires, burning all day and all night. This is where people brought their junk out to discard and to burn it. So when Jesus talks about Gehenna, he's using it as a picture basically of you know I'm not even sure. Like I think I don't. You'll forgive me. I'm not. I don't know a lot about the New Testament, but I'm fairly sure that this is it's taken on imagery of like hell, but I think that at some levels certainly this is not necessarily what Jesus was talking about. He was just making a point about when when you die, that's if you're not in the kingdom of God, then you're going to go to the fires of Gehenna, this burning pile of refuse. And whether or not this was symbolic for him of an actual hell of eternal conscious torment, I don't know. But I think I think not necessarily. So yeah. uh, yeah.
Yeah. All right, guys. So I think we're going to enter now the last 30 minutes of the conversation. So I think we can mix it up now with a few questions, and
Sure.
and especially if they are related to the conversation, they'll be very much appreciated. And I'm going to take the very first one here from Dafa Raffaelli. Um, is translation like LXX also? Sorry, translation like um, uh, also God breathed or only original Hebrew? Can you mention error, mistranslation, intentional change, corruption? Please also mention severe history error in Old Testament. How fluid is the Old Testament text? I'm
Okay.
not sure. Do you,
Oh, there's a
hopefully you
lot
understood
there.
this. Yeah.
I think uh, I'll 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 uh I'll pick at these one at a time. First of all, is translation like LXS also God breathed or only original Hebrew? And well, I mean, I don't believe that any of the texts are God breathed, because um I'm not a practicing Christian. When I was a Christian, I think I would have answered that um that yeah, it's not language specific. Um but I think there are different ways to answer this question. As to what Paul was getting at when he said that all the scriptures are God breathed or inspired. Um So I think he probably had a much more inclusive view than later readers and interpreters of that text did. Um, Paul was living in a time when there was no fixed canon of scripture, even the Old Testament, and this is something that I spend a fair bit of time in with my work in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in early Judaism. The picture that we see of the Bible is one of quite a bit of dynamic uh, development and fluidity, as you as you get to later in your answer. So, as for theopneustos, the idea of God breathed, I think um, Paul probably had an idea of what he considered to be quote unquote inspired, but we don't know what that is. And it could have been, a great many things that did not even make it into our Bibles. Okay. Error, mistranslation, intentional change, and corruption in the Septuagint. Um, the one that I like to point to, which is one of the most famous, is a clear. Um, it's a. I wouldn't say it's so much. It could be a mistranslation, or it could be an honest translation of a scribal error, and that takes place in Psalm 22, verse 16 or 17, depending on whether you're reading the English or the Hebrew. Um, the At one point, this is famously the psalm upon which the Passion narratives were constructed, the stories of Jesus' crucifixion. Um, There's one in verse 16 or 17, it says, like dogs, they surround me. And then it says in the Hebrew text, like a lion, my hands and my feet. It's an awkward phrase. I think there's a good case to be made that there is a corruption here in the text, which makes it more confusing, but not necessarily. I think you could make it work in Hebrew poetry, because Hebrew poetry tends to be pretty weird. Um, Now, what happens when you get to the Septuagint is they translate this passage uh, with the word ka'edu, or sorry, ka'eri, which means like a lion. They translate as horaxon, which is a verb meaning to dig, like to dig a hole. Um, and pretty obviously, they thought that this was the Hebrew verb keru, which also means to dig. So what you end up with is, the dogs are like a band of evil ones. They surround me like a pack of dogs. Um, they dug, or they pierced my hands and my feet. I think the translation as pierced is extremely problematic for a variety of reasons. But this is an instance in which the Greek translator either doesn't is confused by the text that he has, like a lion, my hands and my feet, or he's reading from a manuscript that contains this scribal error where a ka'ari has become Keru. There's a long technical, I can demonstrate from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's a fairly long
So,
technical.
Dr. Davis,
Yeah.
would you then agree with Bart Ehrman on you don't really want to attribute uh, changes or discrepancies to conspiracies, while human incompetencies could be very much be the culprit?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we have both, and I would say far and away most of the mistakes that are in the text are through scribal error.
Yeah.
Um, Very, very. I would say, comparatively speaking, fewer of the changes to the text are made uh, as a means of manipulation. Now, the one I mentioned earlier from Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 to 9, there is an example where the text has been intentionally manipulated in an effort to cover what was a problematic reading. But I think the lots of errors within the text have actually produced some pretty interesting readings and theologies even that have stemmed from them. So, uh, okay, severe history error in the Old Testament. Yes, I would say so. There's a number of cases where, um, in particular, most of the history that we get in the Old Testament appears in what scholars call the Deuteronomistic history, which is the books Joshua, Judges, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings. Um, the idea here is that this was all one very long um, historical reenactment of Israel's past, um, and was told as it it was told within the vein of theological commentary as it aligned to the book of Deuteronomy. Now, certainly there are elements within the Deuteronomistic history which are uh, total fabrication. The book of Joshua, I think, is probably almost just entirely a fantasy. Um, but then there's also parts within the books of Samuel and Kings. I I think I don't know about most scholars, but I certainly know that it is a prominent belief that there was no historical David. There's no firm evidence for the existence of an historical David, a house of David. But again, uh, scholars will tell you we really don't know anything about this guy beyond what's in First and Second Samuel. But what First and Second Samuel tells us about David can't be trusted or relied upon, because the author is telling this very propagandistic theological history. Where we get to the more firm history in the books of the Kings, in particular, in probably the second half of First Kings and all of Second Kings, what you see taking place is the only thing that the writer cares about is how good a worshiper of Yahweh any particular ruler is. So his entire focus, almost his entire focus, is on this one feature. Did this king do what was right in the eyes of Yahweh, or did he do what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh? And as a result, it becomes a very imbalanced history where somebody who was incredibly important, like Omri, um, who might have been the most successful of all the kings of Israel and Judah, gets barely a mention in the Deuteronomistic history because, according to the Deuteronomistic history, he didn't do what was right in the eyes of Yahweh. So that's the kind of historical error that we tend to see. I would say, in particular, within those texts that we would consider to be historical. And I'll just say something about the fluidity of the Old Testament here. Um, so yeah, I think the stuff that I end up dealing with professionally are the manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls, so-called biblical manuscripts, although I think that's a loaded term. But the picture that we see from our best manuscripts, which are those that survive from the Dead Sea Scrolls from about 200 BC to 100 CE, is that the text uh, was fluid, in the sense that scribes were not nearly as meticulous as in the later Masoretic period about ensuring perfect accuracy of the texts. They appear to have felt some freedom in making editorial changes to texts, and also in this period we see a continuation of what I would say something that was taking place already, at least as far back as the Persian, or even the late um, Judean period, where um, er- earlier texts are just being completely rewritten um, in an effort to make them better. The Book of Deuteronomy is basically rewritten Exodus with a bit of numbers. The books of Chronicles are rewritten Kings. You've got within the Dead Sea Scrolls, you've got something called the rework Pentateuch, which is much like it sounds, a total reworking of these older texts. The same with the Temple Scroll is like a rewritten version of mostly Deuteronomy, but this one is, quite interesting because it's all written in first person, and it's set within the mouth of God. So this isn't just Moses speaking. This is God himself speaking this manuscript into, into existence. So
We were
uh yeah, so it's very, what we see all the way up to the time of Jesus is just tons and tons of development, tons of change, and tons of tolerance for differences.
we were talking about the life of Pi off air,
Yeah, yeah, right.
and the way stories are written and the way they are conceived, and expecting the Hebrew Bible to be an accurate historical objective record of events, rather than people trying to make sense of life around them, even to the extent of inventing a tiger to be able to
Yeah,
cope with eating flesh for the first time, and having to live with the trauma. It's real to them. They don't know the
absolutely.
difference. It's so real to them. They're
Absolutely.
convinced by it. But we know probably it didn't happen that way. But this is how they made sense of things.
Yeah,
So maybe
exactly.
would that be
I
the better way of trying to read it in that kind of context?
that I think that's an excellent way of reading the context when it comes to the biblical text. Um, what Pi says at the end of the movie. He says, "I've given you two stories,
Hmm.
one with tigers, and one where I survived a shipwreck alone, and
You pick
in
which one?
both stories I was traumatized, and I suffered," he says. But then he asks the reporter, or the writer who's come to visit him. He says, "Which story do you prefer?" And this is what I tell my students. I'm like, as you're reading the Hebrew Bible, and then as you're looking at what's probably actually going on behind the Bible, if you're thinking about this like an Israelite, you're asking yourself this question: which of these stories do I prefer? Which one makes the most sense? Which one provides for me the 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 most meaning?
Mm.
I think the stories in antiquity had to be meaningful. They couldn't just tell you what happened. They had to tell you why. It was absolutely essential to writing history, and just about anything in that
Yeah.
period.
Well, you think about it, in a world void of any
Yeah,
entertainment,
yeah.
storytelling, it's your TV, it's your theater, it's everything. It's the
Well,
one that makes you wonder, you know?
that's what Philip R. Davies, who is an excellent biblical scholar, once wrote that uh, what did he say? He said um, all I think it was all narratives about the past are story, and that must include historiography. And the point is an absolutely critical one. Even today, when historians go about their work, this is what they're doing. I mean, we do it's more sophisticated now. Well, even that I would, I you know, it, it's there's a closer eye, I guess, to what actually happened now. But even within that, an historian still has to tell a good story. And in telling a good story, you're not always going to get what actually happened right.
It's a question here. I'm not aware that Moses is an Egyptian name. I think isn't it more of a Hebrew, like Masha?
No, so no, I mean I think this is right. I don't know what it means in Egyptian, but I do know that there are cognates and derivatives that we've seen within Egyptian uh things like Tutmos. This Moshe is thought to be um this same it appears to be an either an Egyptian name or some Hebrew writer's idea of what an Egyptian name should have been,
Yeah,
an Egyptian sounding name, right? But the idea that it means drawn from the water is this is the sort of thing that one of something that was quite common within antiquity and within this ancient literature is to assign again meanings to names. And if you didn't know what the name meant, then you made something up that looked
yeah,
like it was
yeah,
close. This is exactly what we see with the name Yahweh. Um, the text in Exodus chapter 3, where Yahweh introduces himself to Moses, this is what he says. He says, Ehya Asher Ehya, Ehya is my name.
yeah.
He doesn't say Yahweh, and the reason he doesn't say Yahweh is because on its own, the word Yahweh in Hebrew doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah.
So the writer of this story had to go, well, maybe it means something close to this, right?
Well, we don't even know how it's pronounced, Yahweh. We know the
No,
consonants.
exactly,
Yeah, it's the four
exactly.
letters. And
Yeah,
I'm just thinking here, like logically, if Moses was found by the Egyptians and he didn't have a name, you think naturally he'd be given an Egyptian name,
yeah,
and not a Hebrew one. But this one, like when really I researched it for some time, and it doesn't fit either criteria. It's not really a Jewish, and it's not really
yeah.
an
No,
Egyptian name. It's weird.
this
It's
is
like
this is
made
why I
up.
think there's some traction to this idea that whoever was writing this story down for the first time and had to give this guy a name just thought of something that sounded Egyptian,
Yeah.
right? But didn't really know.
I'm just glad it's not
I mean,
Muhammad.
it's close, right?
Yeah.
It's like it's like when people emigrate from or immigrate from in the 50s. People would immigrate from African countries or from Southeast Asian countries to North America, and lots of these people when they went to pick when they went to pick names, you know anglicized names for themselves. Lots of these people chose like Elvis, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they did. Well, that's a popular name without,
And you
without
get
really
all these
knowing.
different variations. We know we get names, made up names these days, like
Yeah.
even with changing of letters, Jennifer with a
Oh,
G,
sure.
and
Yeah,
all
yeah,
these weird variations. Some names can have that. It might have a context then, but it seems to be that is a made up name because that person
I
most
think so.
probably didn't exist, and you just create a name. Uh,
Sorry, that's Alexa.
you,
Shut
you
up,
got
Alexa.
Alexa. Yeah, so most probably I think it's a made up name. There are different people you're seeing here that's means son of Ra or born of Ra. You would think based on the narrative, and these people didn't know where that baby's come from. It would be given an Egyptian name, but I think
Yeah,
it was written by Hebrew people who didn't know what Egyptians' name really were. So therefore, you get
exactly,
that distorted
exactly. That's what I
version.
tend to think as well.
Yeah.
So, but I'm sorry, I don't know any Egyptian. I only know that it's something that sounds kind of Egyptian.
Yeah. I can tell you it's not because I've looked it up and I've
Yeah.
researched everywhere. It doesn't even sound like the sounds that a full Egyptian name would sound like in so many
Yeah.
different ways. I mean,
Yeah.
is Moshe in Hebrew now is like an adaptation of it?
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, is it an adaptation of?
of Moses or
Oh, well,
Moshe of
that's I mean
creative?
that's what the Hebrew name is
Yeah,
Moshe, right?
Moshe.
So,
Yeah,
and the anglicized version comes from the Greek transliteration of it, Moses.
yeah,
Um, so, but I, what you run into, I mean, I have lots of well, not lots, but it's still quite a popular name in for Orthodox Jews to name their children Moshe.
yeah. And
There's a
Moshe comes from
fabulous,
Rasha, which
yeah,
is drawn out of water, grabbed out of water. Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. That makes
Although
sense.
I would say it's, yeah, I even that as a cognate, I have my suspicions about. So
Yeah.
yeah.
What about a historical Moses? Do you think he's completely invented, or a Frankenstein of different people stitched together to create that person?
So I think there is, I mean, I would say that the Exodus Moses, the Moses from the book of Exodus is a total fiction. Um, but I think it's a fiction that developed out of this idea of, a prophet who led us out of Egypt, whoever that was, whatever that meant. There does seem to be this underlying cultural memory of emergence out of Egypt, and there's this prophet who
Yeah.
uh it's, I mean, it's very interesting, uh I mentioned that that prophecy in Hosea chapter 12. It is very interesting that this figure is identified and singled out but never named, you know.
Could it be the? I always thought about the all these competing gods and choosing Yahweh as the tribal God of Israel. Could it be that epical, biblical proportion story of the Exodus is the installation of Yahweh as the one true God, and look what He's done for us, and He's deserving of all.
Oh,
No,
yeah. And actually, so the earliest layer of the Exodus tradition appears in one of the earliest texts in the Bible, in Exodus chapter 15. And this story is it's the song of sorry, not the song of Moses. I think it's the song of the sea. Um the song of the sea is a poem or a song um that is all about this deliverance um, from the forces of Egypt, but then also from the forces of chaos. It's as much a creation story, actually, as it is a story of deliverance from a foreign power, which I think is very interesting. When I teach my lecture on national identity, this is, I teach it in this way that the song itself is just completely loaded with creation imagery and reflects fairly closely on some of the conflict imagery that you see specifically when within the Enuma Elish.
right, right, makes sense, makes complete sense. Now this one here, and I think I might have to correct something. I'm not sure if it's a typo.
Ah,
Did Ezra corrupt the Old
ah,
Testament for
okay.
anti-Semitic sentiment? Maybe.
Eh, No, I think he might mean anti-Samaritan.
Okay.
So but right away right away there are no Samaritans at this time. The Samaritans we can trace as far back as about 300 BCE, which coincidentally is about as far back as we can trace Judaism. So,
Hmm.
so I think, and I think now maybe I guess from an historical perspective, I would say um, no, and that's because there were no Samaritans uh, that far back. But if Ezra was a text that was not written until quite a bit later, then I think you might have a case for this.
Ah,
One of the things that the book of Ezra is doing, Ezra and Nehemiah as a group, one of the things, really the thing that they're most concerned about doing is singling out and designated a chosen people. We are the true sons of Israelite, and they do so. We are the true sons of Israel, and they do so by distinguishing themselves from this other group. No, the Ha'aretz, the people of the land. From an historical perspective, this is really interesting because if this is based on something that actually happened, that the people from, if this is based on a group of uh, people coming out of Babylon and into the land of Judah in the 5th century. Um, and if we're assuming these are the descendants of the exiled Jews coming back, now, what's really interesting is they have all these. The whole book is embroiled in these conflicts and these difficulties that they're encountering with the people of the land. So, who are these people? I mean, they're presented throughout the text as these, absolute pariahs, and as foreign, these absolute pariahs and foreigners. But what's really interesting is from like a geopolitical, historical perspective, these would have been, the people from the land of Israel who just never left and went into exile in Babylon. Um, one of the readings of the Hebrew Bible, and one that I'm actually quite sympathetic to, is this idea that it's a book that's designed for this immigrant community, and the immigrant community is the Babylonians, or at this point maybe the Persians, who are coming back into Judea. Who knows whether or not these are actual descendants of the Jews who left to go to Babylon? Who knows? I don't think there's any way to know. But what we do see that's quite interesting is they are importing back into Judah with them a religion that now looks quite a bit more like the Persian religions than the Canaanite religions that they supposedly left with. And this is why you've got such a strong focus on these traditions of uh, coming out of Egypt and entering the land of Canaan, and defeating it at the behest of Yahweh, or why you've got these strong traditions of Abraham leaving his home and journeying into this land of Canaan, this land of promise that Yahweh has given to him. Um, there's a reading of the whole Hebrew Bible where you can say this is all just immigration propaganda that's been issued by these people who are coming into the land out of Persia.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
and
So
for
go ahead,
yeah,
finish the
no,
thought.
and I guess for them, yeah, the contention would be, depending on wherever you date Ezra Nehemiah. I haven't looked into it. I do believe it's probably got roots in the 4th century, but I honestly don't know. Um, then if you're talking about the early Hellenistic period, then yeah, the bad guys certainly are the Samaritans.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah,
I have
guys.
no doubt, though. I'll say one more thing here. I have no doubt, though, that if there was already Ezra Nehemiah by this time, by the early Hellenistic period, I have no doubt at all that the focus, or that this text was used as a way to denigrate the Samaritans. But it's still taking place. I mean, it's taken place throughout all sorts of periods of Jewish history. I mean, this is something that the Zionists absolutely loved Ezra Nehemiah. the the current or several of the much more right leaning governments in Israel have also had a strong affinity for Ezra Nehemiah, and it's exactly for this precise reason. Were the were the pure, were the true, the holy seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and everybody who's living in our land just needs to get out.
Yeah, yeah, that makes complete sense. Guys, all right, we've got another 5 to 10 minutes left in the show, so please get your questions in, and I will be posing one last final question to Dr. Davies here, and one that quite interests me because you can approach it in a way where you have a presupposition or you have a certain bias, but I want a completely objective and neutral and impassionate view on this. Some people believe
Completely
that.
neutral. Sorry.
Your camera froze for a second. There, you're back.
Oh, whoops.
Some people reckon. Oh, there's a bit of delay, but maybe it's an internet issue.
Uh-oh. Can you hear me? Am I? Is it? Am I?
Yeah,
am I
I can hear you, but no. I can hear you clearly, but it's not syncing with the picture for some reason.
Well, that's unfortunate. I've seen that happen. I've seen that happen with my feed before, and that's on. Yeah, that sucks.
Yeah, it's settled now. I think it's just.
I
think the internet.
Shoo.
Yeah, it's back to normal. Back to normal.
That
so
damn
there are
Canadian
a few different
internet.
views on. Well, talk about Australian one is not any better. There are different views on religions. Like some people reckon religions are all plagiarism of each other. You know, the Jesus stories in the Egyptian text is, the Persian old religions, the Canaanites, and everybody's plagiarizing everybody else, and the same story keeps repeating itself in different formats. I don't like this idea, and I'm not an adopter of that idea. There's another idea that says, there were limited amount of information, limited amount of things you can go with gods at that time, and therefore similar opinions could have spontaneously emerged. They look very similar because the human knowledge and the human imagination wasn't as rich. Therefore, they're bound to be similarities in terms of basic ideas like redemption, heroism, the basic stories that we still use in Hollywood today. The five basic stories that everything gets around. Or it might be a little bit of a hybrid between the two. So you've got your authentic little idea, but it doesn't matter if you have a little bit of peek on what is your right-hand student is writing, and maybe copy a couple of things. Which one do you think is more closer to the truth?
Well, I mean, I mean, there certainly are genetic relationships between certain religions. I don't think that's I think that's quite obvious. But as a large idea, I also tend to I also tend to agree with you that the religious language and the religious landscape writ large is probably I guess from an evolutionary perspective is similar to the way that languages developed, right? Like everybody had a language, and languages developed while different, there are certain, there are absolutely mechanics and rules that need to be in place in order for a language to work, and those mechanics and rules tend to be universal. This is what we call grammar and syntax, right? So let's put it this way. I would say that there is a grammar and a syntax of religion writ large. Um, but then we see genetic relationships between individual religions that we can actually track and trace. But I'll say one more thing about this. Long when I first encountered Jesus mythicism, which was quite a while ago, and it was long before I was on YouTube. Um, this is the way that I used to um, confront it, because I was dealing, at this time, this was long before Richard Carrier, and this was long before I was ever aware of Bob Price or Earl Doherty. I was encountering the Akira S. I think that's the right name. Um, Zeitgeist model of Jesus mythicism, and my response to this quite often tended to be that we shouldn't at all be surprised to see so much correlation surrounding this idea of death and resurrection within religion, because it is one of these uh natural things. It was a question. It was an aspect of I guess life and belief that seems to have crossed numerous cultures. So I don't know. Was that a satisfactory answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
I
Um,
completely agree.
I
I'm in agreement. I mean, if in modern history, if Charles Darwin come up with evolution, and Alfred Wallace, a contemporary person, come up with the same idea at the same time, and they never knew each other, and they started having correspondences, and were shocked that they
yeah.
were came up with the same sort of idea. So these things do happen; they can happen. So yeah, it's I'm in
Oh,
agreement
good.
with
You
you here.
found Ray's question. Good. Uh
Yeah,
but it's too bad. uh did you want to read yeah, so what do I think about the association of Yakub Har, the Hyksos pharaoh, and the legend of Egypt? And I I'm sorry. I have no thoughts um about it. I don't know anything about Yakub Har. Maybe I need to read up on this guy. So I can't really comment. I'm sorry, Ray. Uh, maybe you could teach me some things about him. Uh, but yeah, sorry.
yeah. I don't know, but this is going to be very similar to what we were just talked about. That a later or a certain story you think is kind of authentic, but then you go back in history and you find something very similar, and whether it was plagiarized from that
Yeah, yeah.
or it just happened to be similar, because as I said, there are like five basic stories that everything goes around: redemption, heroism,
Oh yeah, yeah,
sacrifice. Yeah, and you keep alternate, and you're gonna end up with similarities inevitable. That's why
yeah.
some movies, they end up sounding the same. I don't think that
No,
it's by design. Just
no, it's
yeah,
because it's because you can only tell so many stories. Um, but it is also amazing how many great stories can be the same story told over and over and over again. Um,
yeah,
I did want to say one other thing about, now that Ray mentioned it, and I feel bad about not being able to answer his question. Um, I want to say something about Jacob, which I think is really neat. Like the name Jacob, Yaakov in Hebrew, it's actually my youngest son's name, who got his driver's license today.
uh-huh.
Uh
Oh, congratulations.
Congratulations, Yaakov. Um, so the name Yaakov in Hebrew comes from the verb Yaakov, which means to grab, uh, to grab the heel, essentially. And this plays into the story of, the birth of Jacob, and he's grabbing on. It says he's grabbing on to the heel of his twin brother Esau as he's exiting the womb of Rebekah. Um, and hence his name. But the word also is used for like trickery and mischief and duplicitous and yeah. So it's got this kind of a meaning attached to it, and it's deliberate because this is precisely who Jacob is within the narrative. He lies to and cheats his brother. He tricks his uncle Laban, who tricks him in return. And he's got this history of having to of using his wits to get by and to get it over on his rivals and his enemies. And this is part of it. And I think this is another thing that people miss when they read these stories within the culture within which a number of these texts were written. It's very harsh. The weather is bad. The ground is unforgiving. The life is very, very difficult, and people, by and large groups of people. This is not a wealthy, thriving society through most of the history of ancient Israel. So it only makes sense that they valued and they lionized these virtues of trickery and resourcefulness and getting it over on the big guy, taking it to the man. Maybe that's actually a better translation for the name Jacob, is taking it to the man. So like, this is when we read these stories of Jacob, and I think from a Western perspective, the response tends to be, oh, that guy, he's such a scoundrel. When, through the ancient eyes, they were like, yeah, you go, Jacob.
Yeah.
You stick it to
But
him.
it betrayed something for me, because with the name Moses, giving a child a name of something that they've displayed at the very beginning
Yeah.
makes sense. Drawn out of
Yeah,
water.
totally.
But having a name for somebody who's going to display characteristic way later in life, it sounds a bit more reverse engineered to me. Like the
Yeah.
event had happened, and then they named
Yeah.
it by
Oh, totally. Yeah, I think that
just
happens.
to get that total
Right.
match.
Yeah. Okay. Septuagint translation. Is it accurate or is it lousy? Well, the Greek texts that came to form the Septuagint were not all translated by the same person or the same people. So, as you read through, and there's also different versions as well. There's what we call the Old Greek. There's Theodotion, and there's Aquila, and then there's it gets complicated. I'm not really a Septuagint guy, but it is a more dynamic picture. But I will say generally that you encounter some texts that are quite good, and you encounter others that are not quite as good. What we are discovering, however, in large part with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, is that what scholars used to think as lousy translations of the Hebrew have actually turned out to be alternative Hebrew versions of texts that lie behind the Septuagint. I mean, probably the most famous of these. I remember when I was in my, I think I was a first or second year graduate student, and I met a pastor once, and he asked me, when he found out what I was doing, the very first question he asked me is how did the Septuagint translators manage to mess the text up so bad? But I would say no. They didn't really. I mean, what we have discovered is that the Septuagint translators had different texts that they were working from. And this, the most famous one being the book of Jeremiah, which is 12% shorter in the Greek version than in the Hebrew one, and in a dramatically different order. It's organized completely differently. This is an alternative version. This is almost certainly an earlier form of the text that was greatly expanded and changed and reducted um, by what became the proto-Masoretic text. So good question though. Oh,
Very good.
there's the channel.
This Thank you. So this is the channel here again, guys. Just to give you an idea, Dr. Davis
Oh,
is just a few subscriptions away
I am
from the
I
elusive
am
8,000.
3 away, guys. I am 3 away.
Are you away?
Come on, tell
Yeah,
your friends.
that should be a big ask.
Uh,
Um,
so
so please go ahead and subscribe. I mean, there's
yes,
wonderful
please.
material in there, and feel free, as I said, Dr. Davis, please, after we had finish this conversation, to grab yourself a copy and upload to your channels, and that's all good. I think spreading this information is very
All
important.
right.
Now, do you have any final comments or anything you want to say to the context and the idea of the ancient Israelites and their habits and their religions?
I will. So I will finish up by saying that it's the ancient Israelites were a whole lot stranger and more interesting in their religious beliefs and practices than we tend to detect from the biblical text. And if you want to know more, my course, Real Israelite Religions, Facts on the Ground, and Propaganda in the Bible, is coming soon through MVP Courses. I hope it to be out uh, by the end of March, or hope mid-April, maybe by the latest. It's coming soon. Um, it's 18 lectures. Each one is about 40 minutes to an hour. There's tons and tons and tons of material in there. I ended up with 122 pages of notes and over what was it? I think it was over 68,000 words um, uh, in this course. So check it out. And if I could just do one more little plug, I am currently working on a series about the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is my actual speciality. It's called The Dead Sea Scrolls Unapologetically. I've finished the first 2 videos. I'm currently working on the third one. This is going to be a long project, and it's a deep dive into the texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and their their contents, as well as their meaning and their place within Jewish history and religion. But if I will say one other thing too, I spend a lot of time in my series talking about the discovery and the publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So if you're interested at all in 20th century history of the British Mandate in Palestine and the formation of the State of Israel, and what was going on in the Middle East in this critical period between the 1940s and the 1990s, then yeah, check it out. There's something in there for you too.
And if you liked our chat today, Dr. Davis, I'd like to have you again in a few
Oh yeah,
weeks and
that'll be
maybe
fun.
chat about.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think I'm really interested in that. I like to discover a few things for myself, and hopefully, our viewers can benefit from the information.
Just
Once
just
again,
not
I'd
the New
like to thank you
Testament.
so much for your time. Yes, yeah, I'm aware of that now. I'm aware of that, and that's good because I want to know the origin of things, because I think it's all
Yeah.
started almost, even Christianity wouldn't never be understood unless you go through Judaism. So it's very important, the origin of things.
Yeah.
So
Excellent.
thank you so much for your time today, and
Well, thank you, Hanny. This was fun.
yeah,
And I should maybe say
Thank you very
thanks to
much. All
Ray,
right, folks.
who
Thank you.
has promised to create 2 new Sock Puppet accounts for me. So thanks, Ray.
Yes, yes. That's pretty cool.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you very much, guys. Hopefully, you've enjoyed the conversation, and we'll see you again later.
Excellent. Bye.